My name is Margaret McManaway. I am the Senior Associate Director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture, and I am delighted that you've all joined us for this evening's presentation, Between Basel and Birmingham, John Henry Newman, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and the Present Theological Moment. For those of you who may not be familiar with our work, the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture was established in 1999 to share the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching, research, and engagement at the highest level and across a range of disciplines. Through our academic research and publications, our Soren Fellows student formation program, and our work to support a culture of life, we grapple with some of the most vexed questions of ethics, culture, and public policy today. And you can learn more about our work on our website, ethicscenter.nd.edu. Tonight's lecture marks the official kickoff of the DeNicola Center Symposium on the Thought of St. John Henry Newman and theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, an exciting opportunity for us to gather an international group of scholars from history, philosophy, theology, and literature into a collaborative, interdisciplinary dialogue on the enduring import of these two giants in the theological landscape. Many thanks to our symposium participants for traveling to Notre Dame to take part in this conversation, as well as to Notre Dame's Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts for their support of tonight's event. We are particularly grateful to tonight's speakers, the collaborators and co-directors of this important symposium, and it is now my pleasure to introduce them and tonight's presentation. Frederick Aquino is professor of systematic theology at Southern Methodist University, where he teaches and works on John Henry Newman, the doctrine of deification, religious epistemology, philosophical issues in theology, and philosophy of religion. He is the author of An Integrative Habit of Mind, John Henry Newman on the Path to Wisdom, and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of John Henry Newman, as well as the forthcoming volume, John Henry Newman and Contemporary Philosophy, co-edited with Joe Milburn, and I think available next month. Among his many professional distinctions, Professor Aquino has previously served as a visiting scholar at the National Institute for Newman Studies in 2019 and 2021, and on the editorial board of the Newman Studies Journal. Jennifer Newsome Martin is the John J. Kavanaugh Associate Professor of the Program of Liberal Studies, Associate Professor in the Department of Theology, and Director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame. As a systematic theologian, Professor Martin has particular expertise in theological aesthetics and the thought of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Her first book, Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Critical Appropriation of Russian Religious Thought, was one of 10 winners internationally of the 2017 Manfred Lautenschlager Award for Theological Promise. She serves on the editorial boards of Religion and Literature, Theological Studies, Communio, and the University of Notre Dame Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Martin and Professor Aquino.
Hello, friends. It's so nice to see you here. What a delight it is to welcome you. I was convinced no one would come, so thank you for coming. I would like to offer, as Margaret said, a particular welcome to all of the scholars who have come and assembled on campus for this interdisciplinary working group on the relationship between St. John Henry Newman and Hans Urs von Balthasar, which will begin in earnest tomorrow. I'd also just like to take the time to thank our research and publications team of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture, especially Justin Patricic, Brooke Tranton, and Catherine Harvey, all of whom I see, for your really hard work to prepare not only for tonight's public lecture and reception, but also all of the logistical support which made the closed-door symposium on Friday and Saturday possible. Finally, I'd like to express grateful thanks to the Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts for their partial financial support of this lecture and the scholarly symposium to follow. This interdisciplinary symposium of scholars from philosophy, theology, and literature will reflect together upon the rich legacies of St. John Henry Newman and Hans Urs von Balthasar, as well as what they might have to say to one another and to ourselves. This public lecture is both a launch and a celebration of that work, but also serves to introduce the theological and philosophical contributions of these important Catholic thinkers to a broader audience. Because we do have a mixed audience here, philosophers and theologians, students, staff, and faculty, Balthasar specialists, Newman specialists, both and neither. It will by necessity be somewhat in an introductory mode. It will also, I hope, share in and model the creative dialogical spirit necessary for our collective conversation over the next few days. I grew up in the Protestant Churches of Christ and eventually became a Catholic. Professor Fred Aquino grew up Catholic and eventually joined the Churches of Christ. Somewhere along these rather perpendicular lines of religious discernment sprang up a great and mutual love for St. John Henry Newman. Methodologically, Fred reads Newman primarily as a philosopher, with interests in questions of epistemology, the intersection of faith and reason and affect theory, while I read Newman primarily as a Balthasarian theologian, with interests in questions on the development of doctrine, Mariology and the saints, and beauty and theological aesthetics. Newman's work, of course, if you know it, is so rich and so wide-ranging, inclusive of theological writings, philosophical works, autobiography, homilies and sermons, essays, letters, poetry, novels, and hymns, that it certainly does justify this riot of readings and interpretive strategies. Balthasar's work is the same in terms of its reach and variety. Books on the patristic fathers and the saints coexist happily alongside theologically rich biblical analyses and his most original contributions on theological aesthetics, theological dramatics, and theological logical theory in the 16-volume trilogy, which engages just as easily with Homeric epics and the poetry of Dante and Hopkins as it does with the dogmatic fundamentals of Trinity, Christology, and pneumatology. You might be wondering, as I am, exactly how a collaborative lecture is supposed to work. This evening, I will be primarily responsible for introducing the life and work of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Fred will be primarily responsible for introducing the life and work of St. John Henry Newman. Both of us will do our very best to be attentive to important and productive sites of potential contact. There is a beautiful book called The Sabbath of History. Many of you may already know it, which places Pope Benedict XVI and Catholic artist William Congdon into what its editor, Paolo Mangini, has called an involuntary encounter, in which Benedict's Holy Week meditations are provocatively juxtaposed with Congdon's striking paintings. New meaning emerges precisely at these meeting points where one is brought into proximity to the other. It is in this involuntary dialogue wherein two voices, different and distinct from each other, can interrogate our times. We are presuming now, perhaps, to engage in a similar project with Newman and Balthasar, two theological and philosophical protagonists who were born and died a century apart, although I think perhaps with slightly more warrant. Balthasar does cite Newman across his works, albeit somewhat sparingly, and one would certainly be hard-pressed to say that Newman was his most influential interlocutor. Yet at the same time, the intuition to interrogate fruitful sites of contact between these two magisterial Catholic thinkers should not be considered as merely an exercise in caprice or arbitrariness. While Balthasar does not necessarily centralize or even identify Newman as a load-bearing influence, the saint is peppered throughout almost every volume of the Theological Aesthetics and Theological Dramatics, invoked, I would argue, at junctures which turn out to be crucial for understanding von Balthasar's own theological project. The idea that Newman and Balthasar might have quite a bit to say to one another and to us emerged rather gradually, glimpsed somewhat intuitively at first, and then corroborated by gathering up an increasing number of partial elements. In a way, then, it emerged like ideas do on Newman's own account, though, of course, I do not presume to suggest that the content of our tentative inquiries will approach the idea of the university or the idea of the theory of the development of doctrine. But for Newman, of course, the idea of the idea is absolutely fundamental to his thinking. He argued that it takes time and effort for human minds to come to apprehend certain truths. As finite knowers, human beings must, over the course of time, consider a polyphony of various perspectives, entry points, points of view, angles, and aspects. There is, Newman wrote, no one aspect deep enough to exhaust the contents of a real idea, no one term or proposition which will serve to define it. If this fact is true for political or literary ideas, it is certainly infinitely more true for supernaturally revealed ones of Christianity, like Trinitarian and Christological doctrines. In short, according to Newman, an idea can be a galvanizing force, both of movement and of unity. As an active, dynamic principle, it always inherently bears within itself a sense of livingness, fecundity, creativity. What we are hoping is somehow to tap into the life of this provisional, evolving intuition and just see where it goes. I would argue, however, that the value of this creative, constructive, and admittedly somewhat constructed dialogue is not limited merely to whatever service it can render toward interpreting von Balthasar's own theology as Newmanian, which would be of interest only to a niche, but probably very cool subset of academics. Rather, it is as it was with that involuntary encounter between Benedict XVI and William Congdon, in which two voices, different and distinct from each other, can interrogate our times. Both Newman and von Balthasar are fiery prophets against modernity, resistant to all the myriad reductions and narrowings and boredoms of a culture which has lost its capacity to see, to symbolize, and to imagine. Both, in a great sign of contradiction to all those who would scoff at their elevation, lift up the figure of the saint and the metaphysics of the saint. Both are aesthetic through and through, admitting subjectivity, experience, imaginative perception, intuition, affect, and the spiritual senses as legitimate ways of knowing. What Balthasar calls the development of pistis into gnosis, faith into knowledge, while never for a moment backing down on the mutuality of faith and reason. Both reintroduce the necessity of symbolic and sacramental language and thought in a hostile environment of modernity which is bereft of both. Both leave utterly no doubt that personalism is the only way forward. Both are entirely captivated by Mary, the merciful mother of us all, whose fecundity and consummate newness invite a compelling model for living tradition, doctrinal development, and a theology of history where nothing that truly lived in the past is ever lost. Both speak compellingly to personal holiness, the ordinary work of sanctity, and to procedures of conversion and discipleship. While much more can and hopefully will be said of all that which Newman and Balthasar individually and collectively can bring to the present theological moment, I might suggest that the most needful thing they bring to our times, both individually and together, is their indomitable spirit of courage. In the 18th of his 97 aphorisms, inspired by reading John Henry Newman, our own Cyril O'Regan has suggested that, quote, an apology for Christianity is not to beg your leave, but to boldly defend what is beautiful, good, and true about what has formed and transformed you. Whatever else might be said about them, it is manifestly clear that Newman and Balthasar boldly defend the beautiful, the good, and the true, and the capacity of the beautiful, the good, and the true to convert hearts and minds. Moreover, as we continue to think together about what exactly may characterize the present theological moment, at least in the academy, I'm reminded of a worry Balthasar had back in the 1960s when he wrote his little essay, The Place of Theology. He was concerned that hyper-specialization in our respective subfields would prevent theologians from ever getting to the one needful thing, that even necessary and good levels of specialization might lead to a forgetfulness of the infinite proportions of the totality of revelation. The theologian, he thought, must always at least, quote, be aware of the presence within the boundary of the unbounded. The presence in the concept of what is beyond concept, in the definition of the presence of the divine object of faith. Every concept in theology must be Catholic, universal, which means it must present the whole truth. Whatever else, we must neither be narrow nor timorous. Both Newman and Balthasar can, I think, reteach us how to see and to integrate the whole so that theology can be oriented toward its most proper ends, worship and practical obedience. Here we shall turn briefly to Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. He's perhaps most well known for his rehabilitation of beauty as a theological category, which could attract and compel people toward embracing the faith. He was born in a well-established patrician family in Lucerne, Switzerland, and received his early education under the tutelage of both Benedictines and Jesuits. As a child and young adult, Balthasar demonstrated an extraordinary talent for music, having perfect pitch and playing the piano, as well as showing peculiar aptitude and interest in literary studies. When he became a Jesuit in October of 1929, however, he initially put aside these more creative endeavors as unsuited to his vocation. He reports a profound sense of calling, recounting an early anecdote in which, as a young man sitting beneath a tree in the Black Forest, he had an overwhelming sense of being called, not particularly to the study of theology or the vocation of the priesthood, but called rather to an attentive obedience to the myriad ways in which he might be called upon to serve God and others, following after the crucified Christ. This profoundly Ignatian spirit of obedience, in tandem with a commitment to the Ignatian principle of all things for the greater glory of God, colored the remainder of his vocational life, as well as his theological work, particularly his enduring interest in canonicism or self-emptying, whether within the Trinitarian relations of Father, Son, and Spirit, in the life and death of Jesus Christ, modeled in the figure of Mary, and expressed in the profound transparency of Christ in his metaphysics of the saints, wherein sainthood exemplifies the salutary posture of Gelassenheit, or letting be. In his study of theology, however, Balthasar found what he called the dreariness of traditional neo-scholasticism arid and stultifying, not only personally, but also relative to the ways he considered the wild glories of revelation to have been tamed by the manualist tradition. There are stories of him reading Origen and Gregory of Nyssa under the manualist textbooks in class, right? He was very uncomfortable with what he saw as a hyperbolic ascendancy of neo-scholasticism. Certain forms of neo-scholasticism were perceived by Balthasar and others as excessively relying upon what would otherwise be goods, and what became a reactionary and myopic restriction of theology to a system of rational propositions of manual theology that were not, in fact, representative either of the complexity or the beauty of the tradition. In response to this climate, Balthasar sought to re-enliven theology by a two-pronged recovery. First, influenced deeply by his teacher Henri de Lubac, the patristic and medieval retrieval of figures like Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor, Evagrius of Ponticus, Bonaventure, Pseudo-Dionysius, and other mystical literature. And second, no doubt influenced, at least in part, by his early interest in training in Germanistics, by an appeal to sources that were not properly theological, namely art, literature, and theatrical drama. He wrote at length about such figures as Homer, Dante, Goethe, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Hopkins, Rilke, and so on and so forth, considering them to be valuable theological sources in their own right. For Balthasar, good literature and the best of human culture is capacitated by the transformative effects of the incarnation to communicate a fundamentally theological truth of being. In keeping with this twin recovery project, Balthasar completed monographs in patristics, on origin, Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor, and literature on Georges Bernanos, as well as translations of French literature, including Charles Péguy and Paul Claudel. His lengthy theological trilogy corresponds respectively to the three transcendentals of beauty, goodness, and truth, making use of aesthetic categories and cultural sources, the integrative breadth of which caused Henri de Lubac to refer to Balthasar as perhaps the most cultivated man of his time. He did write a truly prodigious, intimidating amount, including his major trilogy, which includes The Glory of the Lord, which is not one book, but 7, and they're all like 600 pages plus. Theodrama, 5 volumes, all of the same size. Theologic, 3 volumes, as well as very many occasional texts, including the collected essays in the 5-volume Explorations in Theology series, and his perhaps infamous treatment of hopeful universalism called Dare We Hope That All Men Might Be Saved. Balthasar spent his long career arguing for the recovery of beauty as a transcendental of being, with the same ontological status as goodness and truth. His project of theological aesthetics was largely motivated by a sense that modern forms of theology had been separated from the metaphysical transcendentals, and that these transcendentals had likewise been separated from being itself. The rupture of the transcendentals from being initiates the immanentization and consequent ghettoization of modern aesthetics to a separate, almost entirely rationalistic discipline, rather than being expressive of the whole. True aesthetics for Balthasar cannot be restricted to the finite or the infinite, or the finite, excuse me. It must always have a proper ontological depth. Analogously, on his view, sclerotic propositional theology had reduced the discipline to a species of knowledge and separated it not only from spiritual and liturgical practices and forms of life, but also from the depths of the biblical witness. This impoverished theology obscured and elided objective beauty, the theological analog of which Balthasar identified as glory. Borrowing in part from Thomas Aquinas' distinction of species, form, forma, gestalt, and lumen, light, splendor, luminosity, Balthasar's aesthetics locates beauty at their intersection and as deeply unified with truth and goodness. According to Balthasar, the encounter with beauty is characterized by a simultaneous moment of perceiving. The word he uses means seeing what is true, which is an interesting way of thinking, and being enraptured, carrying within itself the dynamic and attractive force of its own evidentiary power, and causing the perceiver to be shocked, dazzled, overtaken, ecstatically transported beyond herself and her own cognitive capacities, and ultimately invited eschatologically into a full participation in God's glory. While art and literature and natural beauty have a certain, though limited, revelatory capacity for manifesting the ontological depths of being, Balthasar understands beauty and glory to be paradigmatically expressed in Christian revelation, that is, in God's divine self-disclosure and manifestation to human beings. Because beauty is a transcendental of being, it must come from God. Therefore, divine revelation in salvation history, with the incarnation of Christ as its perfectly singular and concrete expression, must be, quote, the very apex and archetype of beauty in the world. And in Balthasar's theology, it is the saints who, given their transparency and porosity to this divine beauty, are elevated as mirrors of and witnesses to it. For Balthasar, the major question of fundamental theology is, in fact, the question of perceiving form. This is an aesthetic problem. That is to say, the proper question in fundamental theology should be, how is God's revelation to human beings perceived? When understood in overly rationalistic terms, when the aesthetic nature of the disclosures of revelation is overlooked entirely, faith becomes subject to all manner of verification procedures, which are counter both to the spirit of Christianity and to the existential whole person element of the human experience of faith, which is also extraordinarily important for John Henry Newman. Genuinely to perceive the wholeness of the form is to sidestep the reductions of the mechanistic sciences and to give credence to that which cannot be explained merely by their limited measures. What is needed to see the form, however, are the eyes of faith, deeply related to the idea of interior illumination of the light of God, which for Balthasar is contact with nothing other than God's own divine being. Only because of an antecedent knowledge of being, Balthasar says, can the human being think rationally and will and love freely. The spirit that knows being always knows and loves more than he can contain in logical formulas and proofs. The spirit is active, synthetic power that goes straight to the real. That sounds a lot like Newman. And that transcends all merely conceptual forms, even as it posits them. It's in this very context that Balthasar does invoke the epistemology of St. John Henry Newman, particularly his illeative sense, a mode of knowledge which is accumulating, intuitive, and inductive, and which is oriented entirely toward the real. From the convergence of the evidence, Balthasar says, the conclusion results as something suddenly seen. Both faith and knowledge thus have something of a subjective and an aesthetic valence, an unveiling of truth in which the one who experiences the revelation of another can say with wonder, "Oh, I see." And to say "I see" in this way is no small matter. Much of Balthasar's work in theological aesthetics is a lament not only for the philosophical and cultural demotion of beauty in the history of ideas to the merely cosmetic or ornamental or decorative and merely subjective, but also the no less serious loss of the formation of spiritual vision, such that the average person no longer has eyes to see. For both Balthasar and Newman, I would argue, faith and knowledge are fundamentally characterized as realities that are simultaneously aesthetic and personalist. Now, Balthasar will identify this particular account of faith, a gnosis which grows out of pistis, as the proper domain of the saints. St. Augustine and St. Bernard come close to this dimension of knowledge when they import the categories of the voluntative and affective as opposed to the purely intellectual and the theoretical. The domain is more deeply understood, he says, in the later language of personalism, which emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. To wit, quote, "Only when by will and affect we understand the engagement of the person in all his depth, only then does intellectual faith become a genuine answer to God's disclosure of his depth as person. For God, too, does not primarily communicate truths about himself, but rather bestows himself as absolute truth and love." Here again, Balthasar invokes Newman, precisely as an inheritor of Pascal in the turn toward a more affective account of faith. While Pascal's reasons of the heart continues to develop Augustine and Bernard along the path of more a personal than an affective bent, it is St. John Henry Newman who perfects this spirituality and account of the experience of faith. It is Newman who, as Balthasar puts it, understands the central act of realization, not in an anti-intellectualist sense, but as the deepening of a merely notional apprehension into an experiential apperception by the whole person. In a culture where many have lost their confidence in religion, theology, history, and reality and being itself, this connected, whole person version of faith, animated by the union of subjective perception and the objective givenness of revelation, the intellectual and the existential, still can remain credible. In his book, Love Alone is Credible, which is little but fierce, to borrow a phrase from Shakespeare, Balthasar makes the case that the personalist aesthetics of love may just be the path forward, not least because it comes to us now, not as our own invention, but as a miracle that must be received in a mode of receptivity rather than doing. I can understand a love that has been given to me, Balthasar writes, only as a miracle. I cannot understand it through empirical or transcendental analysis, not even in terms of knowledge and about the human nature that includes us both. For the thou, the other, will always remain an other to me. Secondly, in the experiences of extraordinary beauty, whether in nature or in art, we are able to grasp a phenomenon in its distinctiveness that otherwise remains veiled. What we encounter, Balthasar says, in such an experience is as overwhelming as a miracle, something we will never get over. Such a convergence of what I cannot have invented, and yet at the same time, what possesses compelling plausibility for me is something we can find only in the realm of disinterested beauty. At this point, that's enough Balthasar for one night, yes? I'll pause and invite my colleague to present on the life and work of St. John Henry Newman in his part of this collaborative lecture entitled, On the Importance of a Connected View. Please welcome Dr. Fred Aquino.
Thanks, Jenny, for those wonderful remarks, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be here and to explore the intersection of Balthasar and Newman. And as Jenny pointed out, my history is slightly complicated in terms of my own upbringing, my own identity of who I am as a person, as a Christian. I'm thankful to my friend Cyril O'Regan for helping me throughout the journey to see where I fit, because as it was pointed out, grew up Roman Catholic, lost my faith in high school, and I am now in a free church tradition called the Church of Christ, working on John Henry Newman, Maximus the Confessor, and various other enterprises. I gave a paper once in Romania to a group of Orthodox Christians, and they thought I was Orthodox because it was on Maximus, and I thought only an Orthodox Christian could read Maximus this way. So it's wonderful to revisit my own history and to revisit the figures that we're thinking about today. Really interesting conversation. So I'm deeply honored by the opportunity to work on this, what I consider a constructive project. By constructive, I mean that it's not merely trying to figure out historically what these individuals said and what they meant. I mean, that's part of the task. We want to know what Newman said. We want to know what Balthasar said. But also the possibilities that might happen as a result of thinking constructively about the possibilities of bringing together their thought without forcing it, cherry picking, as they say. I've been a reader and interpreter of John Henry Newman's thought, primarily his philosophical thought, for some time. I was trained to think mainly in the analytic tradition of philosophy, and so learned to engage Newman in this way. One of my formative intellectual influences was the philosopher Basil Mitchell, Oxford professor, in and through his teacher or student, William Abraham, otherwise known as Billy Abraham, who was my professor. I miss him dearly. In fact, it was Billy Abraham who introduced me to Newman's thought, Northern Irish Methodist, who taught me Newman, which led to my dissertation. While I was a doctoral student, I had questions about the relationship between faith and reason. So I did a course with Billy Abraham on faith and reason in the Anglican tradition. Richard Hooker, William Chillingworth, John Locke, and John Henry Newman. I ended up writing a paper on faith and reason in the university sermons. I found Newman's account of faith and reason deeply relevant, extraordinarily relevant. As a result, my dissertation offered a constructive account of Newman on the rationality of religious belief. It was then published as Communities of Informed Judgment by CUA Press. And I remember when we were about to do the Oxford Handbook on John Henry Newman, the editor emailed me and said, because of my last name, said, I think we need a Protestant co-editor. And I said, well, we have one. So Ben King, if you know Ben's an Anglican, was the co-editor of that volume. Over the years, I've worked with scholars from different perspectives in academic disciplines, some that are in the room, some that are analytic philosophers, some that are not analytic philosophers, some that are theologians of different perspectives and backgrounds. And one of the cool things about coming together for the next 2 days is we get to work together and allow the figures to define the issues and themes that we're going to, instead of, oh, you're an analytic philosopher, question mark. You're not interested in theology. Well, we're interested in theology. But we're also interested in other philosophical topics. For example, one of my scholarly projects was the book Receptions of Newman, published by Oxford. A key aim of this book was to show how scholars across disciplines, historians, theologians, philosophers, and theologians, or from people from theological perspectives, for example, Roman Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians, have actually read Newman historically, philosophically, and theologically, hence receptions of Newman, a plurality of perspectives. In fact, there was no uniform voice among our contributors, just as there was no uniform reception of Newman among those who interpreted his thought. Some took Newman to be a skeptic, some took him to be a fideist, some took him to be a rationalist, personalist. And what we found out in the book was not really what Newman was saying, but how Newman was being read by people from different backgrounds and perspectives. In fact, there was no single use of the term reception by the contributors. We had at least 5 different ways in which people were using the terminology of reception. So we just left it, receptions. And we were accused of not reading Newman very closely, which the point of the book was not, again, to say what Newman said, but actually how Newman was being read by various people and perspectives and backgrounds. The scholarly project, as well as others, has shaped my understanding of Newman's theological and philosophical thought and its relevance for contemporary issues. 2 books will be coming out, one on the grammar of assent with Emmaus Academic Press, which will be a combination of theologians and philosophers on the grammar of assent. Matt Levering is the co-editor of that volume. And then we have another one coming out with Routledge Press on Newman and contemporary philosophy. And what we really found interesting about that is all the various people who were interested in reading Newman, including Duncan Pritchett, for example. Newman as a quasi-fideist. We had people in the volume who were reading Newman not as a quasi-fideist, which is really cool is because Newman is getting now philosophical attention that he deserves. In this lecture, I explore in a preliminary way the relevance of Newman's thought for ecumenical relations. You might wonder why. Well, I think it's pretty clear that Newman is being read now in various ways by different people within different traditions and perspectives. And so the question is, was Newman an ecumenist? First, I'm going to spell out briefly what an ecumenical habit of mind might entail, and especially in light of Newman's idea of a connected view, which he uses in the beginning of the idea of a university. Second, I provide some examples of Newman's own engagement with different philosophical perspectives in both his Anglican and Roman Catholic periods of thought. And then third, I will highlight some places in which Newman's thought may be constructively linked with Balthasar's own thought itself. So a connected view. John Henry Newman, 1801 to 1890, is certainly well known for his leadership in the Oxford movement from 1843 to 1845 roughly, his influence on both Anglicans and Catholics in the 19th century, and his perspectives on disciplines like theology, literature, and education. In focusing on the relevance of Newman's thought for ecumenical relations, I'm certainly not making the historical claim to the historians in the room that Newman was an ecumenist in the 19th century. So I'm not saying Newman was this robustly ecumenical figure. In fact, it's problematic to assume that Newman was super friendly to Orthodox Christians in the 19th century. It'd be really strange to say that Newman was an ecumenist in a Vatican II sense. So I'm not making that claim. I'm also aware of the fact that there's a complex historical set of challenges and critical reaction in light of Newman's own conversion to Rome, like, for example, Anglicans in the 19th century. And recently, Jeremy Morris wrote a piece in which he is assuming that Newman is an ecumenist while recognizing the very difficulties of doing that as an Anglican. So I'm recognizing the complexity, not using this term ecumenical in a sort of easy, glib, ahistorical fashion. Instead, I'm drawing a distinction or attention to a constructive link between Newman's concept of a connected view and the cultivation of an ecumenical habit of mind in a contemporary context. Some of this reflects things I've written recently with the process of Newman being considered as a doctor of the church. How would I view Newman now in ecumenical terms? And so that's what I want to sort of spell out today, briefly. In light of Newman's canonization as a saint and the current process of considering him a doctor of the church, however, a justifiable fear is that the appeal to sole ownership of his legacy could potentially block or hinder ecumenical dialogue. This would be, in my estimation, an ecumenical nightmare. The claim to sole possession fails to truly honor an important aspect of Newman's own legacy or legacies, namely his quest for truth and his recognition of the importance of interlocutors to help achieve such a goal. One way to honor the legacy or legacies of Newman involves examining critically and appreciatively his life, writings, thought, and significance from different perspectives and disciplines. In this sense, the pursuit of an ecumenical habit of mind lies not in making facile connections between the past and present. Newman was thinking as I'm thinking. But in packing the subtleties of Newman's thought, deciphering the relevant connections, and engaging in rigorous constructive work with the help of contemporary insights. More exactly, the formation of a connected view is crucial for discerning whether particular claims, insights, or pieces of information are worthy of consideration and implementation. Along these lines, a connected view for Newman entails, I quote, grasping the mutual positions, bearings, and true relations of various pieces of information in light of one another. That is, to see how these pieces of information fit together in light of one another. Discerning what others have failed to perceive and understand, and showing what this kind of understanding means for the situation at hand. So we want to figure out, by reading Newman, do these various pieces fit together in light of one another? Do they also fit together in light of what we know now in terms of contemporary insights and questions and methodological insights? And are they relevant to the moment at hand? Not only do they fit together, but are they relevant to what's actually being asked in our society? And I think you rightly pointed out at the end the desperate need for theologians to pay attention to what's actually happening in our society and see if we can offer insightful responses to what is actually happening. Now, if that's true, if what I'm saying makes sense, such a goal warrants, in my estimation, a host of interlocutors. People who are going to keep you honest, ask you questions, ask for clarifications, ask for you to unpack, to make good on the arguments that you're making. In fact, the formation of a connected view rarely happens in isolation. Rather, it involves listening, learning, and broadening horizons in conversation with a circle of interlocutors. As Newman points out himself, we do not acquire a connected view, quote, at a single glance or gain possession of it at once. Instead, the evaluative process is cumulative and communal. It occurs by piecemeal and accumulation, by the comparison, the combination, the mutual correction, the continual adaptation of many partial notions, by the employment, concentration, and joint action of many faculties and exercises of mind. It is through honest, rigorous, and open and collaborative efforts that people assess different points of view and learn to develop an eye for deciphering salient connections. Quote, referring many things severally to their true place in the universal system of understanding their respective values and determining their mutual dependence, end of quote. An intellectual posture of this kind compares, yes, I'm going to use the word systematizes, because Newman actually believes in systematic analysis, and weaves ideas from different domain-specific areas of inquiry and seeks to render a coherent understanding of the issues or issue at hand. So a Newmanian, I will use the word Newmanian, not Newman, a Newmanian construal of an ecumenical habit of mind demands a host of critical interlocutors. I think that's precisely one of the reasons for having this meeting. The desire to form, sustain, and embody this habit of mind becomes more evident precisely in the willingness and ability to bring one's own views before those who come from different perspectives and backgrounds. Those who see the value of pursuing wisdom are obligated to show how their beliefs hang together in light of one another, especially when they are engaged in dialogue with their particular interlocutors. The desire for a more comprehensive view of things requires that people be open to challenges. And if challenges occur, they must be able to meet them and make the relevant revisions. I think that's partly built into the idea of the development of doctrine. You're dealing with probabilities, right? The likelihood of something. And so you're going to make adjustments. And I think, as we know from the 19th century, it caused Newman some particular problems. How do you get from divine revelation to the development of doctrine, the probabilistic process that leads to the culmination of doctrine? Very complicated question. And in that sense, Newman is very aware of the relevance of someone like Bishop Butler. How do you bring probabilities together and accumulate those probabilities in such a way that you have certitude, which is, as you know, one of the main questions in the grammar of assent, the second part of the grammar. Although Newman develops the notion of a connected view in the context of framing and developing the idea of a university, it would be a mistake, in my estimation, to say that that's all he's referring to is the philosophy of education, when in fact in the development of doctrine he says the following: "It is characteristic of our minds that they cannot take an object in which is submitted to them simply and integrally. Whole objects do not create in the intellect whole ideas, but are, to use a mathematical phrase, thrown into series, into a number of statements, strengthening, interpreting, correcting each other, and with more or less exactness approximating as they accumulate to a perfect image. We cannot teach except by aspects or views, which are not identical with the thing itself which we are teaching." So in other words, the formulation of an understanding of Christian doctrine presumes a fairly complicated, multifaceted set of considerations that are not always obvious to the mind if we're looking for an explicit, full awareness of all that's going on in terms of how, if we had to catch up with the way our brains work, we'd be exhausted before breakfast. So it seems plausible to suggest then that the concept of a connected view can be extended to shape ecumenical relations. Again, I don't think that's Newman's argument, but I'm saying if we take him at his word that a connected view requires connecting various pieces of insights, both past, present, and potentially with future considerations in mind, then it would follow that ecumenism is not antithetical to Newman's thought. It's consistent. Towards this end, we should seek to do justice to the contextual aspects of Newman's own thought. So I'm aware of my colleagues, my historian friends, who always remind the philosophers and theologians to pay attention to the situation, the contextual situation of the 19th century. And I'm good with that. I appreciate that. I respect that. I honor that. I think I said it enough. I think that's important. But what I want to know is, normatively speaking, does that help me to figure out what is, in fact, what constitutes knowledge, what constitutes understanding, what constitutes the relevance of what somebody has said historically? Because you can take me back there, and I've been with the historians. I've seen them do this. Next thing I know is we're just in a moment of historical conscious awareness, but we also want to know about Newman's relevance, especially if he's going to be a saint, and he is, especially if he's going to be a doctor of the church, and I think he will be, that he has got normative relevance for the life of the church and beyond the life of the church. So So it seems plausible to me that this concept actually applies to ecumenical relations. Some examples to illustrate that Newman himself is a practitioner of what I'm describing. The sources that shape Newman's theological and philosophical thought are complex and multifaceted. For instance, Newman's own account of the rationality of religious belief, for example, in the Grammar of Assent, the idea of the university sermons, engages with and draws insights from different perspectives. If you're looking for one, you're in trouble. Froude, Butler. You just keep going and going and going and see Newman engaging the various interlocutors in his own life or in print. John Locke, for example, is instructive. Now, if we're not careful, we think Newman is an anti-Lockean. I don't think that's completely correct. Newman actually says he is on board with Locke's way of thinking about reasoning, but then he wants to push back on Locke and say, have you really paid attention to the way in which people actually come to believe things that they do in light of circumstances in the real world? But what he's not doing is saying evidence doesn't matter, because Newman thinks there are grounds for why we believe what we do, whether those grounds are simple or complex. And if you think about certitude, he thinks certitude requires some kind of reflexive endorsement of the conditions for a belief being not only true, but a belief that leads to what we would call certitude or knowledge. So Newman's dissatisfaction with Locke's account of rationality does not imply a repudiation of reason. Rather, it calls for a more robust and nuanced account of how reason works within real-world environments. In this case, Newman argues that consulting the world is indispensable for assessing the process of belief formation. His appeal is to, quote, the natural constitution of the human mind as we find it. I am guilty of the crime. I've written that I think Newman, in this sense, is drawing from what we call the British naturalist tradition. Locke, Hume, and various others. Wilkes. Jamie Ferrara said that, so I'm not unique in that respect, but I think Newman is clearly showing, in some sense, a resonance with what we would call the naturalist tradition, not ontologically, but epistemologically. However, if you stop there, you miss out on Newman's wonderful engagement with other Anglican and Catholic thinkers of the time. For example, Newman appeals to probability as the guide of life, in which this is deeply entrenched in the work of Bishop Butler. An important epistemic feature with which the Grammar of Assent is concerned is the role that the illative sense plays in the final resolution of concrete questions. How do we get through the paradox? How do we get to assent, certitude, based on an antecedent set of probabilities? And Locke thought, no way, we can't get there. And Newman said, I'll get you there by citing over and over and over again examples in which the threshold of what constitutes certitude is met, but not in the demonstrative sense of that. So here the illative sense for Newman determines the, quote, limit of converging probabilities and the reason sufficient for a proof, end of quote. Notwithstanding their differences, Newman also acknowledges and appreciates the extent to which his mentor, Richard Whately, shaped his own intellectual formation and his constructive account of faith and reason. As Newman writes, emphatically, Whately opened my mind and taught me to think and use my reason. He had taught me to see with my own eyes and to walk with my own feet. He not only taught me to think, but to think for myself, end of quote. In addition, Newman helped Whately compose a considerable portion of the Elements of Logic, textbook on logic in the 19th century. Newman's engagement with the various philosophical perspectives, theological perspectives, what's common to that is Newman homes in on what we would describe the conditions under which religious belief or any belief could be considered rational. He accordingly challenges the claim that reason is reducible to an explicit mode of reasoning. Such a view fails to grasp or make a distinction between arguing and reasoning. Such a view, he says, in other words, our professed grounds are no longer sufficient measures of their real ones. So in other words, he makes a distinction between the grounds for why I believe what I do and my ability to tell you explicitly the grounds for why I have the belief or the propositional knowledge that I do. Newman also distinguishes between the evidential considerations in the formation of faith and the articulation of them in a publicly accessible manner. Explicit reasoning may, quote, be the judge without being the origin of faith, and that faith may be justified by this mode of reasoning. The difference then for Newman is faith having grounds being some basis, and articulating the grounds or providing an argument for the particular belief that one has. In other words, the operation of the mind is not reducible to the capacity to formalize one's reasoning, and not all grounds are reducible to publicly available evidence or to a formal mode of presentation. Now, he doesn't deny anyone that wants to do that, like Freud, who wants to kind of work through the formal conditions of knowledge, but he says that's not really how the mind works. That's a sort of second level. And actually, Balthasar says this, that having this sort of explicit awareness is not a precondition necessarily to something being rational. Okay. A Newmanian approach to ecumenical relations, constructively construed, as I've suggested, calls for the capacity to connect new and existing insights and to enlarge one's intellectual horizons. People who desire to form a connected view engage in practices such as conducting thorough inquiries, carefully scrutinizing evidence and arguments, investigating numerous fields of study, considering alternative explanations, and giving, receiving, and responding to criticism that is relevant to the claim or claims that one is making. In this sense, engaging with Newman's thought needs to be done appreciatively, critically, and holistically. We should be clear about what we're seeking to accomplish and evaluate accordingly when we're engaging the thought of Newman. We should also not allow a particular point of view to, quote Newman, usurp or occupy the universe, a kind of reductionism. You see the world through this one point of view, and that one point of view encompasses the only way to think about a set of issues when we're thinking about whatever it is, what question we have. All right, briefly, 2 or 3 options that I think, and again, we'll find out tomorrow and Saturday, that I think warrant further investigation or consideration. The first is what we call the passional nature of reasoning, or the cognitive function of emotions. Newman and Balthasar are deeply drawn to the notion that the heart, quote, has its own reasons. Balthasar says that Newman, quote, perfected this tradition. I didn't realize that. Perfected this tradition by understanding the central act of realization, not in an anti-intellectual assent, but as the deepening of a merely notional apprehension by the whole person. It's pretty clear to me in University Sermon, I'm trying to remember, is it University Sermon 12, that Newman begins to show that having an affectionate mind and rationality are not necessarily polar opposites, that it's possible to be affectionately inclined toward an object of faith while employing your rational capacities. So I think more work on Balthasar and Newman on this notion of the passional reasoning would be worth it. Also, I love the expression, the whole person reasons. I really want to know exactly what that means. Balthasar, it seems to be saying, kind of like Paul Moser, although they're certainly different, there's a volitional openness that's a precondition to searching the divine. So in other words, not only does your mind have to be prepared, your desires have to be prepared, all the aspects of human existence have to be brought into the room of exploring who this person, God, perhaps is. And then lastly, Balthasar says that Newman, I quote, believes the ilative sense is an inductive sense. Newman actually says that also. The ilative sense seems to be something that works in the beginning, middle, and end of argumentation. So any sizing up, and Balthasar talks about this in the attunement section, that's really cool. that in a sense, what's happening is the mind is summing up something really rapidly, but it may be that the brain is doing so much work that we're just not aware of. And so there's a kind of perceptual grasp of the conclusion of a proposition or a conclusion related to a set of pieces of evidence. But there's also a process of reasoning that's happening in and through all of that. And Newman says he does this with the external world. He says we have sensations, then we form concepts of those sensations, and then we have ideas, like belief in the external world, which shows a combination of things. Like when we step outside, we don't go through a long process to try to figure out what the external world is. We have a pretty basic, immediate sense based on the use of the elotive sense. And Balthasar seems to think that he and Newman have that in common. I look forward to our time together as we explore the relevant themes, questions, and issues related to Balthasar and Newman. Thank you for your time.
My thanks to Jenny and Fred for opening this conversation for us tonight, which I know will only deepen over the next couple of days. I think in the interest of time, I'll just invite everyone to continue the conversation outside over the reception. And so the only thing remaining for us to do is to once again thank our speakers.